The man was shaking. Not from cold, not from fear exactly, something else. Johnny Cash saw him coming through the crowd backstage at the Reno fairgrounds, spring of 1969, and later he'd say the soldier's face looked like it belonged to someone already dead. The young man wore his uniform wrinkled and loose, his hands empty except for a folded piece of paper he kept transferring from palm to palm. When he finally spoke, his voice came out wrong, like someone relearning how to use words. What he asked for that night would stay with Cash for the rest of his life, and decades later, people still argue about what it meant. If you're drawn to stories that don't resolve cleanly, consider hitting that subscribe button. We explore the moments that linger. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you've ever witnessed something that changed how you understood a person. The fairgrounds that evening smelled like livestock and diesel and beer. Cash had just finished a set that went longer than planned, his voice raw from pushing through songs about prisons and trains and men who couldn't find their way home. The tour was grinding him down that year, pills and exhaustion blurring one town into the next, but something about Reno felt different. Maybe it was the altitude, or the way the desert air came through thin and sharp even after sunset. People milled around backstage, the usual mix of promoters and hangers-on and musicians packing up equipment. Cash stood near a folding table someone had set up with coffee in foam cups, talking to Marshall Grant about the drive to Sacramento the next day, when the crowd seemed to part slightly and the soldier appeared. He couldn't have been more than 22, 23. His uniform marked him as Army, though Cash never caught what unit, or whether he'd just come back from overseas or was headed there. The young man's eyes had that look Cash had seen before in letters from Folsom and San Quentin, a kind of distance that suggested he was watching events from somewhere outside his own body. Marshall noticed him first and nudged Cash, nodding toward the soldier, who had stopped about 10 feet away as if he'd hit an invisible wall. Cash turned and made eye contact, and the soldier took 3 steps forward, then stopped again. For maybe 15 seconds nobody said anything. Background noise continued around them, someone laughing over by the equipment truck, a guitar case clicking shut, but in that small triangle of space between Cash and the soldier and Marshall, time moved differently. The soldier finally spoke. His voice came out quiet, which made everyone nearby unconsciously lean in to hear. He said he'd been at the show, up in the cheap seats where the sound bounced weird off the corrugated roof, and something about the way Cash sang had made him think maybe he could ask this favor. He paused then, and Cash waited. The fairgrounds lights cast strange shadows, yellow sodium vapor making everyone look slightly jaundiced. The soldier's hands were still moving that piece of paper back and forth, and Cash could see it was worn at the creases, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. Marshall would later say the young man looked like he might bolt at any second, like a deer that had wandered into a parking lot and suddenly realized it had made a terrible mistake. What the soldier asked for wasn't what anyone expected. He didn't want an autograph or a photo or a story about June Carter or any of the usual things people wanted backstage. He asked if Cash would write something down for him. Not a lyric or a quote, but a specific phrase the soldier had in his head, something he said he needed to see in someone else's handwriting before he could believe it was true. The request made so little sense that Marshall started to say something, probably to move the conversation along, but Cash held up one hand slightly and kept his eyes on the soldier. The young man's face had changed, becoming more focused, more present, as if saying the words out loud had pulled him back from wherever he'd been floating. He said the phrase again, slower this time, and Cash nodded once and asked if anyone had a pen. The phrase itself was simple. 7 words. The soldier spoke them carefully, like he was worried he'd get the order wrong, and Cash repeated them back to make sure he'd heard correctly. Someone produced a ballpoint pen, and Cash took the piece of paper the soldier had been holding. It turned out to be blank on one side, and wrote the phrase down in his slanted handwriting. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds. Cash handed the paper back, and the soldier looked at it for a long moment, his lips moving silently as he read. Then he folded it carefully, returned it to his shirt pocket, and thanked Cash. His voice sounded different now, steadier, like something had settled. He turned and walked back into the crowd, and Cash watched him go until he disappeared near the exit gates. For years afterward, Cash never publicly stated what the 7 words were. He told the story occasionally, in interviews that went long past midnight, in conversations with other musicians who understood that some moments resist easy explanation. June knew about it, and so did a few people who were close to the family, but Cash seemed to feel that saying the phrase out loud would somehow violate whatever private transaction had occurred between him and the soldier. People who heard the story secondhand would sometimes guess. Maybe it was religious, something about grace or forgiveness. Maybe it was simpler, something about home or love or surviving another day. The thing that made people keep wondering was how Cash described the soldier's face when he read what had been written, like a man seeing proof of something he desperately needed confirmed but hadn't quite believed possible. The context matters here. Spring 1969 sat at a strange intersection in American life. The war in Southeast Asia had been grinding on for years, and the country had split into factions that barely spoke the same language anymore. Cash himself occupied an odd position culturally. He wasn't exactly counterculture, but he wasn't establishment either. His prison concerts had made him a hero to people who felt forgotten by society, while his gospel recordings and marriage to June gave him credibility with more conservative audiences. He could walk into a room full of hippies or a room full of soldiers and find common ground in both places, which was becoming a rarer skill as 1969 wore on. The soldier in Reno might have sensed this, might have understood that Cash was someone who wouldn't judge whatever desperation had driven him to make such a strange request. There's a broader pattern worth noting. Throughout his career, Cash attracted people carrying heavy burdens. Men who'd done time in prison would write him letters by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, and he'd read them, really read them, often late at night when the pills and the touring had left him too wired to sleep. Veterans from Korea and the Second World War would approach him at shows, wanting to talk about things they couldn't discuss with family or friends. Something about Cash's presence suggested he'd been to dark places himself and made it back, which meant maybe he could understand. The way he sang about sin and redemption without making it sound cheap or easy resonated with people who'd seen things that wouldn't translate into normal conversation. Do you think artists know when they're carrying this kind of weight for others? Or does it accumulate without them realizing until one day the load becomes visible? The Reno incident happened during a period when Cash was simultaneously at a commercial peak and a personal low point. His live album from Folsom Prison had made him genuinely famous beyond the country music world, but the success had intensified his drug use rather than easing it. He'd show up to some performances barely functional, then somehow channel whatever remained of himself into shows that felt raw and dangerous and utterly present. The contradiction exhausted everyone around him. June had agreed to marry him the previous year, but she'd set conditions, and he was failing most of them most of the time. The fact that he stopped for this soldier, that he took the request seriously and didn't brush it off or delegate it to a handler, says something about what still existed beneath the chaos. Some core part of him remained capable of recognizing genuine need when it presented itself. What happened to the soldier? Nobody knows. He didn't leave a name, didn't give any contact information. He simply vanished back into whatever life he'd come from. People have searched over the years, trying to identify him through military records or local newspaper archives from Reno in that period, but nothing concrete has emerged. It's possible he didn't want to be found. The anonymity might have been essential to whatever function the encounter served for him. There's something almost mythic about that, the way he appears and makes his request and disappears, leaving only the story behind. Cash treated it that way too, more like a visitation than a regular backstage meeting. He'd occasionally mention it when talking about the strange aspects of fame, how sometimes your life intersects with other people's desperation in ways you can't predict or control. The 7 words became a kind of mystery in Cash's mythology. Fans and biographers would speculate, sometimes quite elaborately, about what they might have been. Some people insisted they must have been dark, something about death or ending, which would explain why the soldier seemed so haunted. Others argued they had to be hopeful, otherwise why would writing them down have seemed to provide relief? A few people claimed to know definitively what the phrase was, but their versions never matched, which suggests either they were guessing or Cash had told different people different things, perhaps to protect the real words or perhaps because he himself wasn't entirely sure he'd remembered them correctly as years passed. The ambiguity might have been intentional. Maybe Cash understood that the specific words mattered less than what the exchange represented. Consider what it means to ask someone famous to write something down for you. In that moment, you're asking them to use their hand, their physical presence in the world, to create an artifact that confirms something you need to believe. It's different from an autograph, which is about the famous person's identity. This was about using Cash's existence as a kind of witness. The soldier needed evidence that these words could exist in reality, written by someone he respected, someone whose voice had reached him in whatever darkness he was navigating. That's a heavy thing to ask of another human being. The fact that Cash recognized the weight and didn't flinch from it reveals something about his character during a period when that character was under serious assault from his own demons. There's a recording from a show Cash did in Vacaville prison, just a few months before the Reno Fairgrounds show, where he introduces a song by talking about letters he receives. His voice on the recording sounds tired but alert, and he mentions how people write asking him for advice or help or just acknowledgement, and how he tries to respond when he can. He says something interesting then, that sometimes people need to know someone else has thought about their situation, even if there's no solution to offer. Just the fact of being witnessed matters. The Reno soldier might have been operating on that principle, needing Cash to witness these 7 words, to make them real by copying them in his own hand. Why those particular words? Why that particular night? The soldier probably couldn't have explained it himself. Desperation creates its own logic. The piece of paper the soldier handed to Cash had been blank on one side, but worn enough that it had clearly been carried for a while. Where had he been keeping it? In his wallet, maybe, or a pocket, waiting for the right moment, or the right person. Had he come to the show specifically planning to make this request? Or had the idea formed spontaneously when Cash's voice hit him a certain way during one of the songs? These practical questions never get answered. What we know is that afterward, the soldier walked away steadier than he'd arrived. Multiple witnesses confirmed that detail. Marshall Grant mentioned it years later in an interview, saying the change in the young man's posture was visible even from several feet away. Something had shifted. Johnny Cash had a complicated relationship with the military. He'd never served himself, having been too young for the Second World War and in the wrong demographic for Korea. By the time Vietnam escalated, he was too old and too famous. He supported the troops in that specific, nuanced way that characterized a lot of his political positions, believing in the individuals while maintaining deep skepticism about the institutions sending them into harm. He'd do shows at military bases, but he'd also sing songs that questioned authority and celebrated outlaws. This duality made him trusted by people on multiple sides of the cultural divide. The soldier in Reno might have understood this implicitly, might have known that Cash wouldn't reduce him to a uniform or a political symbol, but would see him as a complete, complicated human being carrying a specific private burden. The request's strangeness is part of what made it stick. If the soldier had asked for something conventional, Cash probably would have forgotten it within a week. The touring life in that era involved endless repetition, the same backstage layouts, the same questions, the same requests. What broke through were the moments that didn't fit the pattern. Years later, when interviewers would ask Cash about memorable encounters with fans, he'd sometimes tell this story, always carefully, always preserving the soldier's anonymity and the privacy of those 7 words. He seemed to understand that making it public would cheapen it somehow, would turn a genuine moment of human connection into just another anecdote. The restraint he showed in protecting the story's core mystery was unusual for someone in his position, where every scrap of life tends to get converted into marketable content. June Carter Cash had her own perspective on these encounters. She'd sometimes gently tease Johnny about his tendency to take on other people's problems, to feel responsible for healing wounds he hadn't caused. But she also understood that this quality was inseparable from what made him a great artist. He couldn't write songs like Folsom Prison Blues or Sunday morning coming down, without genuinely feeling the weight of other people's lives. The soldier in Reno was just one visible instance of something that happened constantly, usually in ways less dramatic. People would hand Cash pieces of their pain, and he'd accept them without complaint, carrying them around until they eventually worked their way into songs or stories or just settled into the background radiation of his existence. What strikes researchers now is how the story has grown in the retelling but retained certain consistent details. The setting, the soldier's demeanor, the physical act of writing, the phrase being 7 words, these elements appear in every version people remember hearing. The variations come in the interpretation, in what people think the encounter meant. Some see it as evidence of Cash's compassion. Others view it as showing how fame creates bizarre power dynamics where strangers feel entitled to unusual requests. A few people argue it reveals something about the era's spiritual crisis, how traditional sources of meaning had failed for so many young men that they had to turn to country music singers for the kind of confirmation they might have once sought from family or clergy or community. All these readings contain some truth. The story's power lies partly in how it accommodates multiple interpretations without being reducible to any single one. The aftermath matters too. Cash didn't immediately rush home and write a song about the encounter. He didn't mention it in interviews for several years. The memory seems to have percolated slowly, gaining significance as time provided context. By the mid-1970s, when Cash had survived his worst addiction periods and emerged into a more stable phase of life, he'd occasionally reference the Reno soldier as an example of how you never know what your work means to people. The phrase would come up in his mind at unexpected times, usually late at night, or during long drives between shows. He told June once that he sometimes wondered if the soldier had survived, whatever he was fighting. She asked him what he thought the answer was. Cash said he honestly didn't know, but he hoped writing those words down had helped, even if only temporarily. There's a philosophical question embedded in the incident. Can words written by someone else carry more weight than the same words you write yourself? The soldier apparently thought so, or at least needed to test the theory. Maybe he'd already written the phrase himself, alone in a barracks or a motel room, and found that his own handwriting didn't have the authority he needed. Cash's handwriting would serve as external validation, proof that the words could exist outside his own troubled mind. Psychologically, this makes a certain sense. When you're caught in a destructive thought pattern, sometimes you need evidence from outside yourself to break the cycle. The soldier was using Cash as a kind of anchor to reality, someone whose existence in the physical world could verify that certain ideas weren't just hallucinations of hope. By 1970, Cash had largely conquered his amphetamine addiction, thanks partly to June's persistence and partly to his own decision that he didn't want to die stupidly. He'd start talking more openly about the strange encounters that had marked his years on the road, including the Reno incident. But he never exploited it for publicity, never used it in a song lyric or an album liner note. The restraint suggests he understood something important about the exchange, that it belonged to the soldier, not to him. Cash was just the instrument, the means by which something necessary occurred. Taking ownership of the story beyond that would have violated an unspoken agreement. People sometimes ask why this particular encounter has persisted in Cash's legend when thousands of other backstage meetings have been forgotten. Part of it is surely the mystery of the unspoken phrase, which creates a narrative gap that listeners want to fill. But there's more to it. The incident captures something essential about Cash's relationship with his audience, especially the part of his audience that existed on society's margins. He wasn't performing charity or condescension when he stopped for the soldier. He was recognizing a peer, someone else struggling with darkness, and offering the simple help he could provide in that moment. No judgment, no questions about why this mattered, just the service requested and given. That's rare enough in any context, but especially rare in the machinery of commercial entertainment. The Reno fairgrounds where this happened no longer exist in the same form. The city has grown and changed, urban sprawl pushing out into the desert, old landmarks disappearing under parking lots and shopping centers. The stage where Cash performed that night was probably torn down decades ago. But the memory persists, passed along through oral tradition among Cash fans and country music historians. Some people make pilgrimages to Reno trying to find the exact location, though coordinates are vague and memories unreliable after so many years. What they're really seeking, of course, isn't a physical place but a connection to that moment of unscripted human contact, when a troubled young man and a famous singer met briefly and something undefined but important occurred. If you're still watching, tell me this: do you think the soldier ever told anyone about what happened? Did he keep the piece of paper, or did he eventually throw it away once it had served its purpose? These questions don't have answers, but asking them keeps the story alive in a particular way, turns it into something more than just another celebrity anecdote. The not knowing becomes part of the meaning. Cash seemed to understand this intuitively. By protecting the phrase, by maintaining the soldier's anonymity, he ensured the story would remain open-ended, available for each listener to complete in their own way based on their own needs and experiences. There's a recording from much later in Cash's life, one of the interviews he did for his American recording series with Rick Rubin, where he talks about regret and memory. He mentions how certain moments from the road haunt him, not because he did anything wrong, but because he wonders if he could have done more. The interviewer asks for examples, and Cash goes quiet for a long time. Eventually he says something about how you meet hundreds of people, thousands, and most encounters are superficial, but every once in a while someone looks at you with a particular kind of need, and you try to help but never know if it was enough. He doesn't mention Reno specifically in that recording, but people who know the story hear it beneath his words. The soldier with the 7-word request represents all those moments when Cash tried to use his improbable fame for something other than ego or profit. The number 7 itself has drawn speculation. 7 is significant in various religious and mystical traditions, though whether that mattered to the soldier remains unknown. The phrase might have been 7 words purely by accident, or the soldier might have carefully constructed it to that length. We can't know his thought process. What we can say is that Cash took the request seriously regardless of its reasoning, which was probably all that mattered. When someone is desperate enough to approach a famous stranger with an inexplicable favor, they're not looking for logical analysis. They're looking for acceptance and help, and Cash provided both without requiring the situation to make conventional sense. One detail that often gets overlooked: Marshall Grant said the soldier's hands stopped shaking after Cash handed back the paper. The tremor that had been visible when he first approached had vanished by the time he walked away. That's a physiological change, something observable and real, which suggests the exchange had effects beyond whatever psychological comfort the words might have provided. Or maybe the act of finally completing the task he'd set himself, of gathering courage and making the request and seeing it fulfilled, released some tension that had been holding him rigid. Human bodies and minds are deeply connected. When one finds relief, the other often follows. The mystery persists because Cash chose to preserve it. He could have, at any point, simply stated what the 7 words were. Doing so would have satisfied curiosity, and generated publicity, and probably sold some records. His refusal suggests he understood that mystery has value, that not everything needs to be explained or commodified. In an industry built on exposure and revelation, maintaining silence about something was an act of rebellion. It was also an act of respect toward the soldier, whose private desperation didn't need to become entertainment for strangers. Cash drew that line firmly and never crossed it, which is part of why the story maintains its dignity decades later. Where does a story like this ultimately lead? What does it mean for those of us hearing it now, decades removed from the event, with no connection to either party? Maybe the value lies in remembering that behind the legend and the mythology, and the hit records, was a man who paused when someone needed him to pause, who wrote 7 words he never repeated, who carried other people's burdens without complaint. That's a small thing in one sense, a few minutes on a spring evening in Nevada. But small things accumulate into a life's meaning. The soldier came asking for something strange. Cash provided it without hesitation. Both men walked away changed in ways either probably understood completely. The words remain unspoken. The need that drove the request remains private. What endures is the connection itself, brief and fierce and ultimately unexplainable, the kind of moment that justifies the whole difficult project of being human.